Our guest, and this should be very interesting, our guest is Louis Giuffrida, who is director of FEMA. Now, what is FEMA? That's the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and it has its roots a long way back in the federal government, and it's taken on some new work lately. As a matter of fact, it's taken on such a multiplicity of new work that I don't know really where to begin. But Mr. Giuffrida, you're very welcome here. I'm glad you're here.
Thank you very much.
And you are not really new to this agency in terms of federal careers, at least of federal appointments. You've been here since 1981, right?
That's correct, yes.
And
I was called by the White House about the 26th of January, 1981, and came out and met, read the transition reports, and was asked by the president to take the agency.
Yeah.
And this is an executive agency. The director reports straight to the president. That the requirement, therefore, is that after the president nominates, the Senate must confirm.
Right. So you went through that harassment.
Yeah, well, that's a unique experience. It really is a unique experience.
Just ask Alexander Haig.
Right. Well, it takes the director is appointed by one of the more powerful committees, if one can draw distinctions in the awesome power that rests in the Senate, government ops, and the process. Your staff, if you're the agency to which you've been nominated, in my instance, FEMA, the staff goes and breaks out every conceivable contact that has come from the members of the nominating committee, and then you start on a cycle of making visits so that they can connect a name with a face.
Right.
You start the whole process of background investigations and so on, financial disclosures.
And so it took how many weeks?
Well, I was sworn in then in the White House on I think it was the 19th of May, finally. But by that point, I felt, with my staff working so hard to pump me full of data, I felt very similar to the goose whose mouth is propped open, and you pour grain in it until the liver is the right size, and you kill the goose and eat the liver. But
well, anybody who watches the process work on a day-to-day basis here in Washington can appreciate what you're saying. What a hazardous track it is to go through getting yourself set up even after the invitation has gone out from the president. You have a lot of sympathy, I'm sure. Did you really have any second thoughts? I mean, this agency, although it was reconstituted, President Carter had decided that the old emergency management system had to be rejuvenated and switched around, and there had to be some way to get it all under one roof. When you looked at the tremendous responsibilities this outfit had, did you have any second thoughts?
No, I'm not sure that I had any second thoughts in the sense that I think you're suggesting. I spent most of a week in the White House reading all of the transition reports and conferring with Mr. Meese and through Meese with the president and so on. And I suspect that maybe the most single important decision factor in my case was that my wife and my children were solidly behind me in the process.
Makes all the difference.
It really did, yeah. As a matter of fact, I have, on the third day of this thing, I called my wife in California and the children, and I said, I don't think we can handle this because it's a real expense to dislocate. And they said, you go for it. And that became the motto. And that Father's Day, I think it was, my wife gave me a coffee cup, which I use, which shows a mouse trying to carry an elephant, and written across it says, go for it.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Well, you know, your agency, I suppose, is most visible lately in the raps it's taken for the suggestion that cities could be evacuated in the instance of nuclear attack, and where that might go. And I think that during the course of the next 20 minutes or so, we certainly want to explore that and get some explanations, because I'm sure a lot of people are curious about that concept. Frankly, I'm sure a lot of them have a lot of disbelief that it could even begin to work. We'll take a look at that.
Okay, fine.
But right now, we're going to take a break here. This is the Larry King Show. My name is Jim Slade, sitting in for Larry King, who's a little bit under the weather. We'll be right back after these messages.
From the nation's capital, you're listening to The Larry King Show. Once again, sitting in for Larry, here's Jim Slade.
And as I said, if you're just joining us, Larry's a bit under the weather, so we'll stagger through this and see how it comes out. Our guest this morning is Giuffrida, who is the director of the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Now, that covers an awful lot of ground. But when you say that to people at this point in time, they think of nuclear evacuation of our cities in case of an attack, an impending attack. And a lot of people say, how in the world can that happen? But you were telling me while we were off on the break, Mr. Giuffrida, that there was an interesting last line on the transition report about this agency which you were asked to direct, which had not yet been all collected and put together under one roof, was in sort of a stasis, waiting for direction between the Carter administration and the Reagan administration. What did you read when you got to the last line?
Well, the line says, in effect, only a masochist with a death wish would accept the job of directing FEMA.
Well, you still look healthy enough.
Yeah, well, I'm neither masochistic nor carrying a death wish.
Well,
so I had no problem with that part of it.
You had 7 different agencies that were wandering around looking for a way to go, and you had to pull them all together. Mm-hmm. And there must have been chaos for a while.
Well, there was, in fact... There were segments all over in 6 separate locations in Washington. We found some buried in the basement of the Naval Gun Factory at Anacostia, for example. So the first job, the President's mission assignment to me was to make FEMA fulfill all of its functions and be a real agency. And there's an awful lot, obviously, implied in that comments. And we set about, in concert with the White House, to find a home where we could consolidate.
Yeah.
Well, finding a 200,000 or 300,000 square feet of space in one building in Washington is a monumental task. And in retrospect, I think had I known how difficult it is, I might have been a little bit intimidated, perhaps.
I thought you did have a death wish you didn't know about it.
Yeah, well, it's like, it's like you tell an adult to work a Rubik Cube and he gets all unglued because he's heard it's difficult. And you tell a kid to do it, and he does it and chews his gum and watches television, visits with
Nobody
his
told him.
Nobody told him it was difficult. Anyway, we got a building, and we are now in one, and have been, as a matter of fact. When we identified the building, there were several things going on simultaneously. I brought in some outside experts whose judgment I trust, and we reorganized the agency to make some logic out of money, people, and missions. Money and people had already been cut before I got here. Missions were to go and fulfill all that the law assigns to FEMA.
All right, you had the emergency warning system, which we remember in the old days as CONELRAD and the emergency warning system. Now you're going to call it Net 500. You had national flood insurance, crime insurance, riot reinsurance as part of your effort. What else? We're talking about all sorts of things coming in here, but right up there at the top, and that's where people associated, was evacuation. And I saw, first of all, when all of this started, that you were telling me, who lives in a suburban Virginia, that if the warning is sounded, I'm to get in the car and go to West Virginia. Well, I don't think I got time. How about explaining that to me?
Well, I'd be delighted.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Well, because I think it's unfortunate that some people persist in perceiving the attempts to put in place a civil defense program, then limit the definition of civil defense to evacuating people in a nuclear war, because that's not what it is at all. Mm-hmm. The civil defense program derives from the fundamental purpose of government, which historically has been to protect the lives of the citizens. And if you move that to the next logical phase, it means that the government has a legal and moral imperative to put in place a predictable, effective response, multi-level, state, federal, local, to respond to any emergency, irrespective of cause and irrespective of order of magnitude.
Mm-hmm.
And if you were to rank all of the emergencies with which we deal on a continuum, fires, floods, earthquakes, volcanoes, etc., 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 the common denominators in those are identical. To respond predictably and effectively to protect the lives of the citizens, you need communications, you need an infrastructure. Communications, health delivery, food mechanisms, evacuation plans. There's nothing onerous about suggesting evacuation. It means that you have a place, a plan that can take people from places of high danger to places of lesser danger in a predictable manner.
I think the thing that bothers people the most, however, is the time element you're talking about. We're talking about 15 minutes warning. What good's it do?
No, I've never talked about 15 minutes warning at all, and I've never been naive enough to suggest that you could evacuate Alexandria, let alone New York City, in 15 minutes. And I think it's incorrect to suggest that this portion, which if you want to limit the program to a war scenario, that this would be done in isolation from all of the other things that this government has in place. To do any kind of planning, whether you're planning a radio program or whether you're planning a civil defense program, you have to have some givens. And one of the givens that we use is strategic warning. That's not specious. It's not ill-founded. It's absolutely universally accepted. And I defy anyone to find any place, any responsible official, who honestly believes that there would be a sneak attack on this country. No government is prepared to accept casualties of 50 or 60 or 70 or 100 million people. That includes the Soviets. If the Soviets wanted to avoid that, they would have to evacuate those people. And the moment they started that, we'd know it, and it would take them the same length of time to move as it would take us.
In other words, satellite surveillance or whatever we use, national intelligence means as it's called in the State Department.
Plus the mechanics, the very mechanics of putting those people, sounding the alerts, evacuating them out to the relocation sites. Mm-hmm. That would give the time. Now, I think what you and I hope that we can straighten out. When you use civil defense, you're using it in what I consider now in this question as an inaccurate, narrow definition. When I use civil defense, I'm talking about this integrated emergency management system.
Yeah, the system that's about to go into effect as a full-blown plan.
That's right. To handle, as a matter of fact, evacuations. Let's talk about that for just a second.
No, let's do. Yeah, I'm sure that's what's on everybody's mind.
Well, we do evacuations all the time. We use the warning systems all the time. We use the command and control systems, such as they are, all the time.
You're talking hurricanes, floods?
Hurricanes, floods, sure. We move hundreds of thousands of people all the time on that. I brought with me today, when I was reading it in the car, a grand jury report of what was wrong in one of the counties in California, in Santa Cruz County, in their floods of last year. The basic thing that was wrong with it is that they never had a plan.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That they, as a matter of fact, according to this report that I read, there's even a suggestion that the federal government, and this predates FEMA, predates me, obviously. In 1968, they built, they accepted federal money, the purpose of which was to build the system, and they didn't do it. They took the money, but they didn't build the system. And that, if we have some parts of this country that are way ahead of others, because the local attitude is, we won't talk war, we'll talk emergency preparedness.
Mm-hmm. Well, with all due respect, and I hear what you're saying about evacuation and about the early warnings, the Reagan administration keeps telling us that we stand in a vulnerable position, and that a first strike would come with only very small warning.
No, I don't think the Reagan administration has ever said that a first strike would come with very small warning, unless you measure small in terms of days. Now, I'm not saying, nobody will ever give you or me 100% assurance that this country would never be attacked.
Of course not.
Never. Well, I'm glad you agree, because since 1 is infinitely greater than 0, since we don't have that guarantee, and since we have a separate and universal requirement to have in place an emergency response system, then it seems to me logical to build that system to take care of the natural, the man-made, the technological hazards, and that of itself will equip us for the ultimate disaster that everybody fervently hopes will never happen.
Well, you bet. You bet. Of course, that's what President Eisenhower had in mind when he signed into being the interstate highway system. Of course, that you have evacuation routes, and you have plenty of them, and they're straight and wide, and you've got plenty of room to move. That was very good in the 50s. Is that adequate now to do what you're talking about?
Well, first of all, let's take this opportunity to clear up one other apparent misconception. FEMA does not make state and local evacuation plans. The state and the local jurisdictions make the evacuation plans. FEMA spends dozens of millions of dollars every year to pass through money to the states to help them establish emergency operation centers, civil defense centers, if you will, to train people. We have the National Emergency Training Center at Emmitsburg, Maryland. We have collocated there the Emergency Management Institute, the National Fire Academy, the U.S. Fire Administration, senior executive seminars. This week, as a matter of fact, yesterday, the entire command structure, political structure, and volunteer agency structure of Fulton County and the city of Atlanta came in toto to the National Emergency Training Center to take the FEMA Emergency Management course. The reason for these things, Jim, is because you cannot build in time of high stress, on demand, an effective response. Agencies that don't talk to one another when there's no stress cannot logically be expected to talk effectively to one another in time of high stress. That's the genesis of the whole process.
Be prepared ahead of time, have your network ready, have your communications open.
Absolutely. And then test it.
And then hope that it can work autonomously.
Well, not autonomous. There has to be somebody has got to have the con. Somebody has to be in charge. But to simply write a plan on a piece of paper and then not test it, in my judgment, is worse than having no plan at all. Because it beguiles people into believing that something is there and it isn't. We got the Gallup poll to do a check for the civil defense program some 6 or 7 months ago. We chose Gallup because their credentials are impeccable. About 77% of the people in the country support the program and believe that the government is doing something. Now, they were talking about having this integrated emergency management system, even though it was being labeled civil defense. That's what they were talking about.
All right. Hold those thoughts. We're gonna explore this a little bit more. We're gonna have to take a break here. My name is Jim Slade. Our guest, of course, is Louis Giuffrida, who is the director of the Federal Emergency Management Agency. I'll be back in a little bit here on Mutual, which is your network for news and sports. Our guest, which makes it all worthwhile, is Louis Giuffrida, who is the director of the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And many people would equate that simply with civil defense, but it's much, much more. Mr. Giuffrida was telling me during the break there how his agency had overall coordination of whatever would have happened had the Cosmos satellite, which had the misfortune to go crazy in orbit and try to drop its radiological package through the atmosphere. It was his agency that coordinated whatever efforts would have been necessary had that thing struck American soil or other soils, for that matter. We had teams ready to go out and help in the recovery and cleanup, and that was part of your job.
That's correct, yeah, that for the 1402 Soviet Cosmos.
Now, before we took the break, we were talking about evacuation. I think that the follow-on to that, and you make very well reasoned arguments for the fact that you got to have a plan available for doing something, and it has to be there to be used for any number of reasons.
Yes, that's
flood,
right.
hurricane, tornado, nuclear attack. I mean, you name it. You got to have a plan.
That's right.
Now, you also have to have a plan for what you do after it's over. We're talking
That's
about
correct.
recovery.
That's
and there were a lot of laughs at your expense, Mr. Giuffrida, when a lot of this was first discussed, like the Postal Service will continue and the government will continue, and a lot of people were saying, with what? People in the worst of events, and Washington is famous for worst-case scenarios, as you well know, people were saying, my God, you're going to have modified anarchy after that sort of thing. How in the world are you going to coordinate the recovery and putting leadership back into place? How are you going to do that?
Well, of course, let me say to you what I've said to some of the members of the Congress and others. It's easy to nitpick anything. I mean, you can take any
That's what they
segment
pay
of-
me for.
Yeah, no, I don't mean you in this case. I mean people who tried to ridicule the whole process by singling out one obviously enormous problem, and through ridicule and laughter and no really serious debate, but in some cases some very specious arguments, demean the whole process. I would ask you, what is the alternative? Panic is what they were describing. Panic is a function of training and planning.
You mean overcoming panic?
Yes, of course. Preventing
Yeah.
panic.
I wonder-
You train people, you show them what to do and how to do it under circumstances. It becomes almost automatic. And you see training carried to its most visible form in the training of soldiers and others. Training, when you reduce it to the bottom lines, is conditioning people so that a given signal or stimulus will set off a series of predictable, sequential actions, all of which are designed to obviate or to minimize the hazard. And that's what the Civil Defense Program is. The other part of this thing is there are a lot of canards and myths about what people do in times of great stress. And the most readily and usually inaccurately and recklessly tossed is that everybody will go absolutely bananas and shoot thy neighbor and swipe his food and outrage all of the normal standards of human collective conduct. But the experience shows exactly the opposite. People in time of stress do two things. They cluster together to help one another, and they look to the government to have in place some massive assistance which can be brought in to solve the problem. If we ever face that kind of catastrophic disaster of a war, what are the choices? Do we go, as I've heard some alleged responsible physicians say, I'm going to get a bottle of booze and I'm going to go down and lie down and wait for the bomb? Well, if you carry that kind, because we're all going to be dead, and why do anything because we're going to die in 2 years anyway? Well, then why do anything about anything else? We just stop everything in place if we're going to be dead in 2 years. The people, this country, which with all of its problems, in my judgment, is still the most remarkable achievement of social living that man has ever produced.
No argument whatsoever?
None. And I'll admit we got our problems.
Sure.
But the people are going to want to reconstitute this thing essentially along the lines which have served us so well for over 200 years.
All right, let me ask you right here at that point. Do we have existing in this country today the governmental structure that would allow the orderly shifting of governmental responsibility into the interior of the country? Right now we have a very exposed coastline. We have the heart of the government here on the East Coast. Do we have a federal governmental structure that is able to pick up the load in the less vulnerable parts of the country?
Every country everywhere in the world has got a plan to ensure the continuity of that government. I don't think any country that I know of is fully satisfied with what it's got. Ours has not always received the attention that it, in my judgment, justly deserves, and that is one of the programs in which we are heavily engaged. Portions of it, for logical and legal reasons, are sensitive and classified. But the honest and simple unclassified answer to your question is there is a system, and we are working to make it better and more responsive throughout the entire government, not just through FEMA's efforts.
What would be the new governmental center of the United States? Would it be Denver?
No,
Would
I
it
don't.
be Chicago? No, it wouldn't be Chicago. Chicago would be in the middle of all this. Fort Knox, Louisville, Kentucky. What?
No, we are looking at any of a combination of techniques and locations and places to ensure that would help us to ensure that the government could proceed to all the branches of the government could proceed to fulfill their functions.
With communications what they are, you wouldn't have to have it all in one place anyway, would you?
Well, of course, communications in any circumstances is the essential ingredient. I think the lawyers call it the sine qua non.
That's right.
Even this, I mean, this stimulating discussion we're having would be impossible without communications in place.
Oh, right now we're reaching the entire United States via a satellite system that is one of the most beautiful things I've seen in 28 years of broadcasting.
Yeah, well, we're using that system as part of our warning system
I know you
for
are.
natural disasters and other kinds of emergencies.
Right.
So you see, we're working in the same milieu.
Yeah. What you need is that satellite that the shuttle launched the last time in place. That's going to be a very nice thing, the TDRS, and that will be available to government transmission as soon as it's in place.
Yeah.
Well, we have to take a break. We'll get back to more of this and a very stimulating, interesting discussion we're having here this morning. And maybe we're uncovering some myths and maybe we're poking some pins, but that's what the fun's all about. Our guest is Giuffrida, who is director of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And let me tell you, that's a big umbrella. And we'll get back to more of that in just a minute.
From the nation's capital, you're listening to The Larry King Show. Once again, sitting in for Larry, here's Jim Slade.
And our guest is Giuffrida, who, of course, as we've said in the last few moments, once or twice, is director of the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Let's, we've been beating you around the ears a little bit here for the last few minutes, and I suspect that when we get on the phone that some other folks will want to pick up where we left off. But let's get back into some of the other things you do. Net 500. We're talking about the old Conelrad system there, aren't we, with improvements? Everybody knows what that is, I think. If this were not a test, you'd be dead,
The emergency broadcast system
Right.
is what we're talking about. Yeah, well, the emergency broadcast system has been, very fortunately, has been around for a long time. It has not always received equal or proper treatment, either from the broadcasters or from individual DJs or from the system as a cohesive whole.
It's like a stool in the corner. You don't pay much attention to it
Well,
sitting
for
there.
example, when I was living on the West Coast, and my kids were like everybody else's kids, they were up to their eyeballs in the rock stations.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a rock station we used to listen to. And at that time, I tell you, Jim, I never in my wildest dreams did I think that I'd ever be in a position to have anything to say about EBS. But every time they were getting ready to do an EBS test, this cat would come on. He would ridicule it so completely as a lead-in that he had turned off the audience before it even came on. I mean, he made a farce of it. It used to infuriate me every time I heard it. And I would speak to the president of the station, whom I knew, excuse me, and he'd say, well, the guy, he's just, he's doing his thing. I say, but Judas Priest, look at the fallout. I mean, look at the consequences of what he's doing. In any case, we working, Mr. Holton from my staff, excuse me, and the rest of my staff, been working with the broadcasting industry, with FCC and with everybody else, to make sure that the system is available when the country needs it.